Hi everyone. Now in this session we're going to try and understand whether China's global power is being used as a force for good or whether on the other hand it is actually being used as a force for ensuring China's future dominance and future access to resources in other LEDCs and some MEDCs. Okay, all right. Now a nice way of actually characterizing the difference is by trying to understand what hard power is and what soft power is. A nice example of this is when you hear the terms one bridge, one road, or the Bridge and Road Initiative. Contrast that with how Xi Jinping will prefer to actually refer to these projects as the old Silk Road Initiative, okay, a new maritime Silk Road. So it's really interesting that China is almost trying to undertake this investment project as a means by which they believe they can actually make other countries richer and develop trade and move those countries up that economic ladder. But others see this as a direct threat. So for instance, there's a lot of skepticism. Just recently, Theresa May has refused to actually acknowledge how beneficial this One Bridge, One Road or Bridge and Road Initiative will actually be, because there is a lot of suspicion about Beijing's motives here, and the belief that it is just being used as a means of actually expressing China's economic power and economic might upon other smaller, more vulnerable countries. Okay, right. So another example that we could also consider here is the role of Chinese aid and loans. So some of those loans being provided might be in the form of financing various rail lines in Africa, for instance. But alternatively, what about the loans that are in effect made to the US Treasury by the purchase of US Treasury bonds? Now, is that hard or soft power? Is China doing that as a good, a force for economic good and to develop economic stability? Or is it actually trying to influence some sort of form of power and influence over the US economy? Perhaps they just see themselves as being an interconnected country, which they are, in a globalized world. And of course, China requires globalization to be successful. So it becomes highly contentious as to whether you see these as examples of hard or soft power. We've also discussed, of course, China's influence on the African continent, and how some people believe that is a new form of economic colonization, or neo-colonialism as it's also known, and that China is actually just ensuring they have ample access to abundant natural resources in those African countries. Okay, then there's also the argument regarding what is the best form of capitalism for LEDCs and transitional economies more generally. Is it this model of state capitalism which Beijing has employed so effectively within the Chinese economy? And if we just contrast that with the Washington Consensus, which we will have a look at in a later video, what we can see here is that this Washington Consensus, which has been encouraged and promoted by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, has become very unpopular in many LEDCs. Take for instance the likes of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and also South Korea. Now they had the World Bank and IMF visit them after the Asian financial crisis and impose stringent conditions on the emergency lending that the IMF provided on Washington's behest. Now, all of the reforms that they advocated were in line with the Washington Consensus. Of course, China now has its own equivalent, the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. Okay, of course, there's many members of this banking group, but it is very much seen as a rival to the Washington-based World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Okay, again, is this hard or soft power? Is this being used as a force for good, or is it being used as a means of actually exerting power and influence over other economies? Okay, then there's the example of Chinese New Year. Now, China is deliberately allocating $10 billion a year towards soft power and developing that soft power. And one of the ways they see fit in doing this is through promoting Chinese New Year and other Chinese cultures. So whether it's Chinese language centers, whether it's Chinese lantern festivals, or alternatively, the notion of New Year. China want their New Year to be as big in Western countries as Christmas is. Is that ambitious? Absolutely, of course it is. Is that ever likely to happen? Well, you never know. The rate at which, say, for instance, Halloween has grown over recent years may actually point to a very, very plausible outcome there for China. So they want to be seen as a force for good, and one of the ways they can exert this influence is, of course, Chinese New Year. My son's been playing a lot of Temple Run 2 recently, and I noticed there was a Chinese New Year update on there. Who's funded that? Well, yeah, it's another interesting one. Okay, then, of course, the military presence in the South China Seas. This is obviously hard power. China wants access to a part of the South China Seas which is disputed between the likes of the Philippines, Vietnam, I think also Malaysia, as well as China and possibly Taiwan as well, and that's the Spratly Islands. Now China have now built an airstrip and they have a really severe military presence there. That's because they believe there is resource wealth in that area. So they have just literally pushed those other countries out of the way to access the potential resources which are under the seabed there. Okay, and then of course we've got this changing centre of economic gravity. The centre of economic gravity is heading east as the Eastern Asian economies continue to develop and grow. China will one day become the largest economy in the world by GDP. Okay, not by GDP per capita for very, very many years, if ever, of course. Okay, and at the moment, it already contributes a third of global GDP growth. So this is really, really significant. Okay, there's a lot of skepticism about China's influence over the world. The Americans are very, very concerned about it. So is it a force for good? Is it a force for just them building an empire? In addition to this, you can also imagine that they will want the renminbi to be seen as a powerful reserve currency for other financial centres across the world. So they want that to be able to rival the likes of the euro, the dollar, the pound, and so on, and the yen. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But you've just got to remember, is China's global influence and global activities overseas, is it a force for good, or is it actually a force for just building an empire? Okay, thank you very much.